the Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers discuss veterans issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
How's it going, Pierce? Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you as well. Today we're going to be talking about addiction again, but first let's cover some good news. In a world dominated by sensational doom and gloom news, we felt it would be nice to start each show off covering a good news story and sharing our thoughts. So with that, what do you have for us, Richard?
All right, I have an article on cancer. Scientists discover a missing link between diet and cancer risk. I'm going to give you the punchline here. A previously unknown mechanism for inactivating genes that suppress tumor formation helps explain why cancer risk is associated with an unhealthy diet or unmanaged metabolic conditions like diabetes. So let me get into some of the meat of this really quick, and then we'll get into some discussion about this because it turns out cancer has played a role in both of our lives.
Yes.
All right, so the research team first examined people who inherited one faulty copy of the BRCA2 genes. They found that cells from these people were more sensitive to a compound called methylglyoxal, MGO. Now, let me break that down real quick for everybody who's not a biologist or a cancer researcher. Methylglyoxal is an organic compound that is implicated in the biology of diabetes. MGO, that's the short version of that. MGO is produced when cells break down glucose for energy in the process of glycosis. So without getting too far into the tall weeds on how our cells work, essentially, glucose is how our cells fuel themselves. And when they break that glucose down, it doesn't just turn into fairy dust and unicorn sprinkles. It turns into things like this MGO, which it turns out is actually problematic for the cell. But no problem, our cells have enzymes to handle it. So glycosis generates over 90% of the MGO in cells, which a pair of enzymes typically keep to minimal levels. In the event that they can't keep up, high MGO levels can lead to the formation of harmful compounds that damage DNA and proteins. In conditions like diabetes, where MGO levels are elevated due to high blood sugar, these harmful compounds contribute to these disease implications. So the genes that protect us from tumors that are named in this article are called the BRCA2 genes. Well, our topic isn't about those genes today specifically. What's important is that those are implicated in their suppression, which is to say that high concentrations of methylglyoxal suppresses those genes' ability to in turn suppress cancer cells, to suppress cancer from formating. I should try that one more time. From forming. There we go.
Yeah, I was going to say they probably have influence or start creating some type of protein that attacks the cancer genes from forming, right, or something along those lines. Typically, it's something.
Yeah, there's a complex role in cells where there's protein and enzymatic function that, when everything is working smoothly, they handle whatever surplus amount of materials like methylglyoxin. They handle all that, and the cell performs its life cycle without any complications. But if they're suppressed or if they're not working properly, then those cells that have those malfunctioning components that are not suppressing or dealing with these concentrations of methylglyoxal, the article is about that function in the creation of cancerous cells. So let me reiterate, these harmful compounds contribute to disease complications, methylglyoxal being one of those. The researchers discovered that MGO can temporarily disable the tumor-suppressing functions of the BRCA2 protein, resulting in mutations linked to cancer development. This effect can be seen in non-cancerous cells as well as patient-derived tissue samples, in some cases of human breast cancer and in mouse models of pancreatic cancer. And all that's saying is that they checked in two places. They checked in multiple places, in the biological context and in the grown in a lab context.
Yeah.
So as the BRCA2 allele isn't permanently inactivated, functional forms of the protein it produces can later return to normal levels. Oh, so there's hope. It can recover. But cells repeatedly exposed to MGO may continue to accumulate cancer-causing mutations whenever existing BRCA2 protein production fails. Okay, overall, this suggests that changes in glucose metabolism can disrupt BRCA2 function via MGO, contributing to the development and progression of cancer. So the link here, I'm going to scroll down here to kind of the last conclusion sentence. Furthermore, high methylglycol levels can usually be controlled with medicines and a good diet, creating avenues for proactive measures against the initiation of cancer. This is a natural process that our bodies engage in, both the production of methylglyoxal and its remediation. Both things are normal. And what the authors and this article are proposing is that that's related to diet. And if we get into diet, we can start exploring why high glucose could be a product of certain types of diets. Of course, they're using these completely subjective words like a healthy diet. Oh, everybody's supposed to have a vision in their mind of what diet is. You can just move on with the article.
Yeah.
What's really important with the good news is that we can see that link. And that link is really important for a lot of reasons. And I want to specify that when we talk about the topics of cancer specifically, but science in general and medicine in general, we have these different populations of people who are involved in the discussion and the total climate of the discussion. So
The
one
Venn
group of people,
diagram of
for
the
example,
subject.
yeah, totally. One group of people are going to be scientists. These are going to be people who study tissues. They have a biological perspective on the problem of cancer. They're going to study living subjects. They're going to study animal subjects, living human subjects, animal subjects. They're going to study cells in the petri dish, right? They're going to have this perspective on what cancer is that is very much tied to the most specific and esoteric qualities of biological science.
They're not
Then
going to
there's another
try
group of,
and excuse me, I was just to say they're not trying to necessarily cure cancer. They're studying cancer. They want to know what makes it grow faster, what makes it grow
yeah,
slower, what makes it proliferate, what causes it to mutate, what does cancer look like in different things. They're not necessarily there to just cure cancer. They're actually there to study everything about cancer, the
right.
good, the bad, as its own life form or life mutation form, So yeah,
Yeah, and what they're trying to do is figure out all the exceptional cases and what ties them together, because cancer that forms in the lungs or the brain or in the reproductive tract they're all going to be different versions of the same type of thing, which is an uncontrolled growth of cells. And they're going to have different causes. So reproductive tract cancer, for example, polyps uh, on the cervix, in the case of women having reproductive cancers, those are caused by human papillomavirus. So the cause is clear. The causal link is clear. The treatment is clear. Get vaccinated for HPV. And now we solved this one. It is a lethal cancer, but we've solved it. It's done. But then there are cancers elsewhere in the body that don't have such a clear link to an outside invasive um, uh, vector. And
and
then
I'm
you get into
sure
these.
what we're going to be alluding to is secondary or like primary causes that cause like the surface cause might
Yep.
be the superficial cause might actually just be that the superficial cause, which is something rooted deeper in not necessarily our ancestral physiological background, but maybe our childhood. And
All
so,
right.
yeah, I
Yeah.
imagine this is, yes, anyways.
You see my crystal ball, Pierce.
Yeah.
So, um, then this other group of people who are interested in the cure for cancer or to its treatment anyway are going to be physicians and physician researchers and oncologists.
The people trying
And
to
these
kill
two
the
groups of
cancer.
they're literally they have taken up the charge in prolonging the life expectancy of a human subject, a person, a patient who has quote unquote cancer, and their subject matter expertise is maybe broadly applied across all terminal organ systems, but they have methods for approaching those terminal organ systems that does reduce the growth of cells. So that's a group of experts who thoroughly understand the systems level approach to what cancer is and how it works. There's a third group of people. The third group of people are people who have had cancer. That's me. I represent this group of people who were diagnosed with and treated for a disease of uncontrollably replicating cells that interfered with my biological function and were lethal. And so when I read an article like this, of course, I have this lived experience with its treatment and my lived experience with its creation and growth. And I'm keenly interested as to, well, what were the causes and implications for the version of cancer that I had? And why did my treatment have such great outcomes? Like I'm 5 years, I'm more than 5 years since my um, diagnosis and treatment, and it hasn't returned yet. I really haven't changed my lifestyle much, but it hasn't come back yet. And so we're gonna be able to talk about what that means. So, and then there's a fourth category of people who are everyone who is either in some way a relative or a friend or some type of acquaintance of the people who are going through cancer treatment, and they're trying to figure out what the implications are to them as a third party to this, and how they can be involved in some way to help, how they can be involved in some way to increase the identified patient, how they can increase their outcomes or their recovery. So cancer
Yes,
is this
yeah.
thing that is vastly larger than the word would suggest, and it's influenced vastly more by uh, each different group of people than you would think as an objective observer. And so when I saw this article, I thought, wow, what a great opportunity to get into this topic and talk about what wide-reaching implications cancer has for our cells personally, but not only that, the integrated nature of our bio-neuro, social, and natural history model. What that means in that connection.
Yeah, when I remember talking to my mom a lot after she had recovered from breast cancer, and she had had it through she was diagnosed with it when I was 10, um,
Mm-hmm.
and had it until I was 16. It almost died a couple times in the emergency room. It was very bad. She had to do chemo, radiation, the whole shebang. Um, and I remember in my early 20s, I just had like in my head, I had said, cancer comes from worry. I thought it was a worrying disease, and I didn't know much besides being that fourth category that you mentioned, the ones who are related. And I'm sure, I mean, cancer is so prolific now, it would be you'd I imagine have to be a unicorn to not be related to someone or to know somebody who hasn't gone through
Mm-hmm.
cancer, if
Mm-hmm.
not passed away from cancer at this point because it's just such a um, prolific disease. But I remember saying that to my mom, um, and I always used to think that I was like, this is a worrying, this is caused from worrying, which I know is just interesting to look back now and just understanding more of the physiology and stuff. And um, I don't think I was that far off, actually. A little bit of worry does. I think I was miscategorizing worry. It should have been maybe trauma or some type of um, uh, mental effect due to uh, past lived experiences. But I I thought that was an interesting little excerpt to add. But I would talk to my mom about this often, just kind of when we would talk about her remission. And, luckily she also hasn't had cancer come back as well. And, so it's always good to hear of stories of remission, especially once you get to that 5-year mark and
Yeah.
above beyond. I don't know why that's a significant number because, it's not like other cancers aren't just looming around the corner, but, yeah. So anyways,
Well, I thought I would expand on a couple different aspects of what we're talking about with regard to, you know, that fourth category, which I've basically reserved for you as a person who is a bystander to someone going through the treatment. The treatment for cancer is, without too much hyperbole, brutal. It is a brutal experience. Depending on which type you have and for how long you have to go through the treatment, you kind of can imagine that the longer you do it, the more debilitating and destructive it is to you. And that's kind of known in our culture that the treatment's worse than the disease. As people are experiencing the treatment, they think, "Oh my God, I would have just had it done with." No, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad I went through the treatment, but I want to clarify that one of the treatment systems that is used to treat cancer is a formulation of it's kind of a cocktail of different drugs that
poison. It's
are,
poison.
well,
They, you know,
they literally
I
are,
mean,
and
it's yeah. It's like,
the way that they're administered, what they create is the repression of cellular growth. That's their whole purpose. So, if you were given a beaker full of these drugs and just drank them straight from the beaker, uh, they'd kill you. They would be bad for you. In fact, part of the story of my treatment regime was that I was offered a choice between an oral medication and a um, infusion medication, which is to say the type of medication that you take intravenously.
the one that takes
And they,
20 minutes to administer because it's like that thick, it's that huge canister. If we're talking about the same thing, I remember, I think I actually just experiencing my mom groaning for like an
Mhm.
hour while this intravenous goop is administered to her like weekly. It was just for years, it was just brutal, and she would just be groaning because her veins were collapsing. I mean, because after a while, yeah. Anyways, yeah, it's eliciting very strong memories of this huge shot, the biggest shots like I'd ever seen in my life, basically. Yeah. So
So, the intravenous method, and like I said, everyone has a slightly different experience depending on the type of cancer they have and the medical system that they're involved in. And the medical system that I take no credit for, being involved with, it totally was a mistake, or not a mistake, but just randomly I blundered into this and was very fortunate to have, because they provided an exquisite form of care. There was nothing about my experience that I can actually cite as being negative or that I have complaints about, despite the fact that given the option between oral medication and infusion medication, I chose the oral medication, which nearly killed me. Like, the oral medication was not the way that I healed from this disease state. And I'll expand on that here in a moment. I chose the infusion medication, which is to say that, or excuse me, after I was recovered enough from the oral medication, I then was on the infusion medication, which is a slow delivered. Uh, it's slowly delivered over a period of several days into a port that was installed in my chest through an infusion pump that I wore on myself, and went about my daily life.
jeez.
So I literally carried the system of administering the drug on my person in a pouch and just kind of went about my business. So the oral medication is the same exact drug. It's just that when it's delivered via GI tract, the physician titrates it to a level of concentration with the expectation. The physician designs the pill with the expectation that our bodies destroy medicine. Our bodies take the medicine, disassemble it in the gut and GI tract, absorb some of it, and then we cast off everything else. So whatever percentage that's going to be, they have to kind of guess based on trials and statistical evidence. Now, I am a very special snowflake. I lack the enzymatic machinery that disassembles and destroys that type of medication. And so what I was getting in the oral medication was the 100% dose, which is a lethal dose. It is a very bad situation.
So you literally took the
sick.
Poison. It was the poison that I was just alluding to.
Yep,
wow.
That's right. So that's not incompetence on the physician's part, because I'm one in several 100,000 who actually have this enzymatic mutation
or the
this
unlucky
anomaly.
lottery winner that had
Bingo.
the biological artifact of your ancestors. Someone had, or maybe it was a genealogical mutation that was an experiment.
Who knows?
Who knows? But either way.
But I just happened to be the one that was unlucky enough to say, sure, I'll take the oral medication, and also I don't have the enzymatic mechanism to destroy medicine. It put me in the hospital for nearly 2 weeks. Jeez. So I just lived in the hospital and described for my nurses what my stool was like every day, which was no fun. It was bad. It was a bad time. So the infusion system ultimately was how I took my medication, and for 6 months, every 2 weeks during that 6-month period, I would go to the oncology clinic, receive an infusion of medication while sitting in a chair just like the one I am in right now, with my feet up, covered in a nice blanket, with a needle stuck in the port in my chest. And I would take this medication for 4 hours. Then they would put the infusion pump on me. I'd wear it in a little bandolier, and it was stuck into that port. And then that is how I continued to take the dose of medication that I needed that would be sub-toxic. It's toxic, but it's sub-clinically toxic, and it's doing the process of repressing cellular growth. And I suppose I could get into great detail about what that means, but the implications are it is essentially eradicating the cellular layer in the GI tract, not specifically because that was the target organ system, it's just one of the side effects. It strips away that cellular layer in your GI tract that allows you to take nutrients from food. It makes digestion really difficult, and it makes other GI distress highly likely. So for 6 months, it was just a continual uncertainty around where the next restroom was going to be. The other thing that is a part of the cocktail...
I was going to say, and which food were going to be acceptable, right? Like, basically, it's like, okay, well, my diet's about to radically change, and I'm about to play diet bingo here. Yeah.
I had a cast iron stomach, as they used to say. I could just eat anything. I can't tell you the number, hundreds of pounds my day, and all the other things I would just ingest without any regard. This is no longer my life, by the way. I have been fundamentally changed by this in such a way that my diet is now. It's not painful to me. It's just painfully restrictive if you have a diverse diet. If you looked at what I eat now, you'd say that's no way to live. Well, it works. Mm-hmm. But it's the consequence of a radically changed GI tract. The means of, part one of curing cancer is removing the tumor entirely. Well, since it was sitting on my large intestine, that meant that the surgeon took out about, when you say 30 centimeters, that's going to resound with some people who understand the metric system, but for everybody else, think of 12 inches. think of your 12-inch ruler that you have in your drawer at home or at school. That's how much of it's missing. And that's an important 12 inches of a 9-foot long structure because it's implicated in the absorption of a great many things that I now can't consume because it's been changed forever.
Yeah.
So I'm getting into a little bit of the consequences of what it means to be treated with and then to live after a bout with cancer. But that's like, those are the types of things that a lot of people adjust to, and it's fine. I have the way that I live my life at this point is much more about considering the intentional approach that I have to things that I do and how I live, as opposed to the precedented times before I had the disease, which meant kind of blundering through life and crashing into things and then just seeing how it went. And that's not one of the outcomes of that is the disease state that I. So
Oh my gosh, this feels like the best segue right into our offline discussion about Robert Sapolsky and Daniel Dennett. Dennett? Uh, God,
yeah,
just
Dennett.
because I've been writing nonstop about this, and what you just described is essentially my argument that I've relayed to you actually this morning.
Yeah.
About subconscious, like the subconscious engine basically running your life, that is versus your prefrontal cortex, which is your agency machine. What you've described is you've had to take more agency of your life and actually pay attention to yourself and what you're doing
And
and
that
your well-being.
yeah, in that way, cancer was a gift. It's a lot of times gifts are wrapped in, some type of containing structure, and this time the gift of um, a project of trauma recovery was what was wrapped in the gift of cancer. And so there's a great many stories I could tell about this, and I'm glad that we're doing this podcast because it means we'll probably get into them later. But as a way of introduction, the article that I read that is good news about this relationship between um, uh, methylgloxal and the suppression of that gene, the BRCA2 gene. The reason that that's really interesting to me, and the reason that that is such good news, is the following. This is going to be a short version of this. And that is that one of the words in the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is stress. It's right there in the name, right there in the tin. You can't confuse it for anything else. But the problem is that most of us don't really know what stress actually means. We have a colloquial version of what stress is. So, how are you doing today, Pierce? Oh, I'm running here and there. I'm pretty stressed out, right? Kind of keeping things, balls in the air, that
You're
kind
on
of thing.
campus. You're around a bunch of stressed out individuals who are always
Totally.
trying to
Oh,
get
I'm really
done with
stressing about my
deadline
exam.
exams, deadlines that they
Yep.
have, so on and so forth. So yes, they lots of stress. I've got the family stress. Yeah, of course. So colloquially, yes, stress. Absolutely understand the meaning there. Colloquial, I
Yeah.
can't say it.
That word is so hard. I barely pronounced it just now.
Not
So
gonna give it a
anyway,
shot.
there's a discussion that I think we're gonna I believe deserves a lot of content on. The good news is that we're not going to bore the audience with a lot of content on. We get to talk about it in context. And so for the audience, I'm about to step into what is called the subjective mode of conversation. This is going to be anecdote now. I am not talking about the link between stress and cancer as a single straight line. What I'm going to be talking about is the link between a disordered metabolic system and its link to cancer, because that is what the research talked about. So there's this topic of stress and allopathic load, and I have a couple of slides up here, so you'll see me glancing off screen a little bit to look at them. And what I want to talk about, because it's going to come up over and over and over again, and I'm so glad that it will, it's the hypothalamic pituitary and adrenal axis,
Yes.
the HPA axis. And what's so fundamentally important to those of us who have been diagnosed with PTSD and those of the rest of the world who haven't been diagnosed with it and much more likely have complex PTSD is this. In our lives, we encounter stressors, the exam that we're taking, the drive that we have to work, a person that we work with at the office or job site that we hate being around, right? There's all these different versions of these negative stressors, or these people or things that make life harder than it has to be. And so our bodies respond to those stressors. That response is allopathic load. Allopathic stasis is to induce these systems like the HPA axis, utilize them for their purpose, and then downregulate or attenuate their purpose after the stress is over with. That's allopathic stasis. It's not flatline. It's not that you're always in some serene environment. It's that you can oscillate between that green zone and that yellow zone and back again. And when I talk about this green, yellow, red zones, this is something that it's a infographic that I refer to quite often. It's the stress, safety, and polyvagal events hierarchy.
Okay.
It's in the shape of a parabolic curve. And what it does is it talks about the role of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Big topics. We'll go into it later. But green and yellow, green representing kind of being serene, yellow representing being in allopathic load. All right. So the HPA axis is this really interesting endocrine response to stress. And what it means is the cumulative effects of chronic stress on mental and physical health. Allostasis refers to how the body's physiological systems change in order to meet the demands of the environment, specifically for survival. I read that kind of fast. Don't worry. We're going to have these definitions available to the video. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is the primary driver of endocrine stress response when initiated by the amygdala. Another big word we'll come back to in a second. It's an area of the brain that contributes to emotional processing. When triggered by the amygdala, the hypothalamus, it's a collection of nuclei that connects the brain and endocrine system, signals the pituitary gland to produce a hormone. Guys, I do have a direction I'm going here with you, so you're going to love the turns out, but bear with me. Which in turn signals the adrenal glands. These are located right above the kidneys to increase the production of cortisol. We've probably heard of cortisol, actually. It comes up a little more often than, popular culture. It shows up in different venues of, the wider culture. It's not just the research scientist work. Cortisol is a marker hormone. It's it's one of the steroids. That's the word.
As I say, it's a powerful steroid that we
Yeah.
use for all kinds of things. It's a topical steroid, cortisone, or there's all different.
Yeah.
If you have had, like, if you have dogs and ringworm, you probably have some type of cortisol tube in your bathroom or someplace because of that.
So the topic of stress and allopathic load tends to kind of vilify cortisol, but cortisol is just one of the tools at our disposal for survival. It's actually not a bad thing used in small doses. Where it gets bad, or where its implications are negative, is where it's prolonged. And there's lots of examples in the human experience where something that's good in short bursts but bad in prolonged bursts exists. And we could connect it to mechanical systems that we could think of, performance systems that we could think of. But really, it's just one of these steroids that our body produces that aids in our survival. And guess what? Those of our ancestors who survived made use of these systems, and they are represented in modern as a consequence of that. They were selected for. All right, so cortisol increases the level of energy fuel available by mobilizing glucose. It mobilizes glucose and fatty acids from the liver. This is endogenous glucose production. Endogenous meaning created by the self or made at home. Cortisol is normally produced in.
Question on that. Does that mean
Go ahead.
it's stealing from what you it's what you're digestive, what you're eating, what you ate that day, or is it stealing from fat cells that's like stored glucose in fat cells? Which one is it
Bingo.
grabbing from? I'm just
So
curious.
it's what it's doing is mobilizing material that you had stored.
Okay.
So there are these interesting paradoxes with people that are highly stressed. And when you meet them, there'll be one that's rail thin, and there'll be one that's obese by 150 pounds. They have the same problems. Their body is dealing with the how it handles those stressful situations in very similar ways, but on the backside, it's the outcomes of how that whole process follows through that's different for each of them. And that's why when we talk about people being stressed and looking rail thin, and the opposite, the person who's pretty overweight, same problem, same systems are in play, same metabolic action is at play. It just turns out that their different biologies are handling this infusion of hormones differently, or the post processing of them, for example.
So I have
So,
a little bit of evidence to add to that claim right there. So funny, my wife, when she gets stressed out, will,
mhm,
grab a sugar cookie or something like that. But I would
yeah.
say what keeps her thin versus from, becoming what you're describing, where you're 150 pounds overweight or whatever, and what I notice is she's using it in a very short interim, just like any of your hormones should be used to deal with the stress immediately. It, but she's not in turn. What I would see an unhealthy use of it would be she grabs the whole bag of cookies and then continues to eat the cookies, right? But she just grabs a cookie and then she'll have like a sip of whatever, soda water, I think, because she likes the fizz. Those two things. Maybe it could be salt too. She'll do this with like, oh, I need like a couple um, salt and vinegar potato chips or something. She has a couple bites
Hmm.
of those, and whether she's basically regulated her sugar or salt at the moment, and then boom, she's cool.
Hmm.
Um, so just kind of, I thought that was a nice little piece of um, personal evidence to what you're talking about right there too. So
So I think you're really on track, and the central thesis behind what links what I talked today about that news article and what I'm describing right now is duration. So intensity and duration tend to be factors in whether or not a adaptive survival strategy is healthy or unhealthy. So what you described is someone who's having um, situations where intensity and duration are relatively short. I'm going to make all kinds of assumptions about uh, her life and how leading it, but it's probably not one that's going to degrade her health over time. But this topic that I'm reading about is that idea.
yeah.
So cortisol is normally produced in varying levels throughout the day, typically increasing in concentration upon waking and then slowly declining throughout the day, providing daily cycle of energy. Cortisol is also, it relates to fasting. So as when we fast, our cortisol levels increase. What's happening? The metabolizing of those um, fatty acids that are stored in the liver and other parts of the body, and it's turning those into energy that tolerates the fasting. And it's not pseudoscience per se, unless someone's selling you something that's totally pseudoscience. It's around the keto diet, the concept of how the keto diet. So fasting and cortisol are related. Stress and cortisol are related. Cortisol is the marker hormone, or the steroid that's implicated in the mobilization of glucose.
And possibly eating disorders as well. I'm sure it sounds like it's got its hand in some ugly places in the eating disorder pyramid or triad, I guess. I'm laughing, but I mean I know this is it's not a laughing matter, but you know
Well,
I what
you're enjoying the figuring out these connections because
yeah
it's huge to make these connections.
yes, and
So
I should yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
during a stressful event, an increase in cortisol can provide the energy to deal with prolonged or extreme challenges. The amygdala triggers the release of hormones from the HPA axis, and when it is in confront excuse me, when it is confronted with a dangerous situation or frustration. Frustration is an important word here. So that's the HPA axis and cortisol's role in the HPA axis. The amygdala is susceptible to stressful events. It's capable of modifying its function and morphology. These modifications play an important role in stress-induced psychopathologies, including anxiety, depression, and addiction. The amygdala is involved in threat neuroception. The amygdala plays a role in activating the HPA axis, and the amygdala plays a role in cortisol release and therefore glucose metabolism. And everybody who's watching this now is because they know that what I'm setting up is the relationship not between stress and cancer, but the relationship between the cascading effects of prolonged stress, glucose metabolism, and its role in suppressing those tumor suppressing genes. That's the big idea here. It's not a direct line. You don't just say, oh, that person's stressed. We're guaranteeing they're going to have cancer later. What we can do is say, in a population, people who have this much stress in their lives, and that can be measured by cortisol sampling.
Prolonged stress, yes, prolonged stress as
Yes,
well, yes.
long-term stress and how they deal with it can relate to their potential for acquiring one of these debilitating diseases and comorbidities, excuse me, the comorbidities around cancer and these other disease states. So I want to make it clear that I'm not a physician. Hey, everybody, don't stress out so much, it'll give you cancer. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that stress is one of the features in glucometabolism and its various possible how it gets out of balance and how it gets into these catastrophic states if they're maintained.
Yeah.
So I'll finish this note on the amygdala. In other words, the amygdala can change size and shape and become primed to danger perception even when risk is low. It can also change the brain around its heightened response. So the amygdala is a part of the limbic system. It's a part of survival. It literally is what allowed our species to end up where we are now in history. It
And
is
correct
part of our
me
natural history.
if I'm wrong, it also has a lot to do with emotional memories as well, tied to events,
Bingo.
which is pernicious. So I have a lot to say because I've been reading a lot about all of these systems that you're talking about right now, and but I want you to keep going because I know you're closing in on the article here, but gosh, it's sparking the conversation I want to talk about.
So these alterations involve genetic, epigenetic, we might come back to that later and talk more about it, and molecular mechanisms, as well as dendritic and synaptic reorganization processes. Now, there's a lot packed into that one. It's too many big words, but
Hmm.
what I'm saying in that one sentence is, at the fetal stage, our amygdala is coming into existence and being formed either in an environment of high stress and high circulating stress hormones and metabolic structures around glucose and so forth. And from that point forward, that sets up a little bit of the determinant and predestined features of our life. If our mothers were stressed when we were in utero, the likelihood that our amygdala would be organized around high sensitivity to risk or to stressors or to danger is much more likely. This is huge. This is a very important idea in that stress, glucose, uh, MGO, the cellular the suppression of tumors. Let me try this one more time. Tumor suppression in our cells. That whole link.
Yeah.
It starts in utero. It literally begins before we breathe our first breath of air. And so I wanted to get into this a little bit to tie these ideas together about why it was such a gift to, that was wrapped in cancer and chemotherapy, to now be living under the situation where I need to know these things because they are so representative in the natural history that got me. And they were the natural history that very likely degraded my and affected my immune system and attacked cells in my colon that created that disease state. So
It
I'm going to read a little. I'm going to read a little bit here from Stress and Health Implications, but I'm not going to do the entire paragraph that I have prepared for this. I just kind of want to bring this to a closing state. Did you have a
yeah.
question?
Oh, I was just gonna say, um, much of what word that I talk about in the future, but I wanted to say that it was almost as if the cancer and the treatment subsequently was the jolt that you needed to wake up from your subconscious default state of being. You were kind
Mm-hmm.
of basically, and I'm, of course, like completely uh, generalizing your life down into this one
Right.
state, which is, of course, not what I mean, but for the purpose of this argument, is essentially like, um, I'm making a lot of assumptions based on my own life. I would say my adult life could be before I was roughly 32, could easily be summed up as me being directed by my default subconscious self in like basically trying to make most processes in my life subconscious as opposed to conscious, and only leave the fun stuff for the conscious. And that's what my brain literally did. I don't know if
Yep.
yours was the same coping mechanism, but it sounded like the cancer basically was the jolt that was like, oh shit, I'm my subconscious state is really good at keeping me alive in this second while the trauma is happening right now. But sadly, the amygdala and the limbic system and all of these keep you safe in the moment systems are terrible at planning for the future. They don't foresee long-term stress and danger to your health. They can't protect you for that. And then in fact they're terrible at protecting you for that. Anyways, I'm starting to go on, so I want you to continue, but these are kind of a precursor to a lot about what I've been writing about recently. So, yeah.
I should mention that my diagnosis and treatment for cancer happened when I was 42. I was not in my 50s. I was not past the age when physicians had been recommending that, um, getting scoped out by a gastroenterologist. No, it happened easily a decade earlier than the um, medical practice would indicate that it would. So there is a lot that's conspicuous about this that I'm making the case that it wasn't related to my diet. I was eating basically a vegetarian's diet at the time. I wasn't eating a bunch of red meat and boxes of donuts every day. That wasn't my lifestyle. My coffee's black. I'm not putting a bunch of sugar in it. There's a number of things I could say that my diet really wasn't the problem. My weight wasn't really. I was under 200 pounds back then. No, you could look at the entire matrix of my biology and health regime, and this guy's got 20 years before he has to worry about a polyp in the colon. And at 42, it was an aggressive growth that was moving so quickly that it literally stopped the passage of anything through my GI tract. That's over with. So nothing I consumed was going to pass through my GI, and it meant that I was going to stop eating because that was the only option. and death was waiting for me. Yeah, it can really be a wake-up call. And I'm not exactly saying here, hey, I hope to make myself a warning to everybody else, a cautionary tale, as they say. What I'm saying is, I have a lived experience because I'm one of those 4 quadrants of cancer, the human experience of cancer. I'm
Hmm.
not a researcher. I'm not a physician. I'm a patient. And then the other quadrant is, of course, everyone else that lives with the identified patients while they're going through this, which is profoundly stressful to them. All they know is that if they cared about me at all, that I just had a brush with death. I did it right in front of them, and as I'm going through treatment, I'm basically on death's door every week. So let me begin to kind of wrap this up, and I want to talk about the health implications of stress because I've made the overture already. Stress is a precursor to a cascade of events that is now neatly tied up with how cancer research is being directed. A distinction can be made here that even though effort and stress that impacts allostatic load are both physically similar, what is different is that post-stress affect or mood. Now let me try to do that a little bit clearer for the audience. I wrote this out and there's punctuation there that makes it kind of tricky. Essentially, allopathic load is not negative or bad. It's necessary. Allopathic load is a jolt of the pursuit of living. And so it can come from climbing up a rope in gym class to all those 2-mile runs that Pierce and I were doing for our physical fitness exams. It's, um, uh, let's say you're driving not on your commute to work, which is where my problem comes from. Let's say you're driving a race car because you're racing because it's your whole thing. It's your career and it's your livelihood to race a car and finish first. That's allopathic load, and it's good because when you get out of it all goes away and you revert back to your normal passive
Yeah,
state,
going
your
down the
normal peaceful
slope in
state.
a snowboard, you're gonna be
Bingo.
you've chosen to anything that's kind of an adrenaline, adrenaline rush or adrenaline junkies. Those are all allopathic loads from what you're describing, and those are things we
Yeah.
seek out, right? Like a little that thrill gives us a jolt, reminds us we're alive, right? That
Yeah.
kind of those are. And that can be dangerous in excess as well too, as we
If
know.
you're
But
deprived of allostatic load,
yeah,
that's a death sentence as well because it's terrible for our brains. Being deprived of that allostatic load is essentially that's its own plank into the abyss that
yeah.
you're walking on. That's that analogy of walking the plank
Probably
as
a
a form of
version of
death sentence.
necrosis. Yeah. Um,
So what's different about allopathic load that's beneficial and allopathic load that's detrimental? Like I said, it's intensity and duration,
hmm.
but it's also how how it comes to an end, how it's concluded. So if we jump on our snowboard, go down the slope, do a bunch of cool tricks, slide over the finish line, and then our our caring and generous mother, our sweetheart, and like 5 of our best buds run out and wrap their arms around us and
And
then
we
carry
beat
us
the rich
aloft.
jock, right? We beat the rich jock
Yeah,
down the mountain, and we're being
what
carted off by all of our loved
right.
ones.
We did all the things that represent human accomplishment, right?
Yeah.
It's stressful, but then we're carried off by these loving and caring people, and we're we're held in their embrace. We're brought into this connective place with these other nervous systems. Then what we're doing at that point is then down regulating the HPA axis as a system of survival. So it's going to be off topic today, but there is a whole discussion that I have on the role of oxytocin as an attenuating neurotransmitter to all of the other neurotransmitter stress hormones that are related with HPA axis activation. And what you get from that post-race moment, that post-race exaltation, is downregulating those stress hormones and connecting the nervous systems. So that's an example of how That kind of allopathic load is great. That's the best possible situation. But it's met with reconnection and downregulating. When it's not great is where the loop stays open. We never connect, we never downregulate, and what we're left with is the half-life of these materials out of our bloodstream without the aid of connection.
So, except for my thesis right here, where this is where I'm gonna just go, yes, yes, but on the last part is we do connect. Oxytocin is released to substances or experiences that allow us to cope, maybe not
Bingo.
downregulate, but a version of downregulating to the stress that is constant, right? You have this constant stress. So imagine like I grew up poor. I grew up in a very poor house, especially the first 10 years of our life. My mom made our clothes. It was that kind of poor. So I showed up to school with the weird clothes
Mm-hmm.
made of curtains, which obviously has effects on a kid when you're young.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people grow up in poor. A lot of people in America grow up in poor. For all of our international potential viewers in the future, if you want to know, like the richest country in the world, it's relative, first off here, right? Like I make six figures. I live in the Santa Clara. I am poor. People would say, well, that's crazy, blah, blah, blah. I'd be like, yeah, but my rent for a two-bedroom apartment is $3,600 a month, and it's a 60-year-old apartment, right? Like, so I could get a $600,000 house up in Portland right now, but with the mortgage would equal essentially what I pay for rent down here. But if I wanted to buy a
Mm-hmm.
house down here, I would need $2 million to buy a piece of shit that would take another $500,000 in 2 years to renovate, and it wouldn't have a backyard. So it was all relative. I grew up poor in America in the 80s, um, which is pretty poor. um, anyways, so that stress of being growing up poor, I can imagine. I mean, that has to do because it's a constant feeling. Like everything is related to money. Um, if the head of the household uses money as a control mechanism, which mine absolutely did, everything was a gift or a gift given, and everything was required of me. Um, Tasks were all tied to money. Everything was tied to money. How do you think, I pay for the roof over your head and
Mm-hmm.
these are all familiar sayings, I'm sure, to a lot of people and yourself, Richard, of like, I bought all your clothes, the food, the shirts on your back, all of that stuff. You exist because I allow you to exist. That was the household that I was raised in, as far as money went. Um, so I can imagine that stress, that constant stress. But we do attach to things. We do use unhealthy systems to downregulate, um, which leads to possibly cancers earlier on in our lives as second order effects due to these types of coping mechanisms and attaching to different things. So.
Well,
That's my
if I
ad, but yeah.
I'd like to I'll get back to my last little bit here, but what I want to say to your point is in that pre-cancer period was the most excessive drinking that I was doing. My relationship with alcohol was the most enthusiastic at the time. And that's because the daily cycle of HPA axis activation went as such. I was highly activated on my way to work. I would get to work where I was well liked, well supported. Everything about the job I was doing was beautiful. But then I would get back in the car and drive home, have this major HPA axis activation again in the commute home. And when I was home, I couldn't tolerate being around my family members because they added to this hyper agitated, hyper aroused environment that they didn't downregulate it, they made it worse. So then I would spend the next 6 hours enjoying the beverage of choice and half-lifing out the the stress the stress chemical melange that was coursing through my blood veins, that was affecting how my brain worked. And it was all in service of downregulating all that at some point, and they'd finally sleep at the end of it. And this was a cycle that was going on every single day, regardless of what happened during the day or whether I drove. It still existed. It persisted.
I
And so
You're
you could
describing
make
my
the,
last year in the army too. I was doing
yeah,
the, I mean, my drink of choice was a Canadian Mist, which is barely whiskey, by the way. But yeah, I mean, I would go through multiple half gallons a week of
mm-hmm,
that and show up to formation in the morning and go
totally.
to, just, but I mean, I had a drink. I was, the second I was off of work, I was drinking by like four. And like, I mean, what, HP, what's the last one?
HPA. It's the
HPA axis.
hypothalamus pituitary and adrenal axis, HPA.
So my HPA would have been similarly stressed out from all the
Mm-hmm.
normal factors of stress as I was getting out. I was being medically retired out too and going through a divorce at the same time. So, yes, I
Yeah.
completely understand that using the drink of choice to down regulate. Whew. Yeah.
So this is why what we're talking about has all these interconnected and nuanced facets of interaction. It's not just one thing. And by the way, there's plenty of research out there that will tell you that a precursor to certain types of cancers is alcohol consumption. But no one ever says, well, why is the subject drinking? No one ever asks the question, where is this a they might be fixing something with this. This might actually be a solution for them. Whether or not it is chemically plays a role in the creation of cancer, no one ever talks about whether or not there's something massive going on that the alcohol is completely it's a total solution to. It fixes all those other problems.
That alcohol
It
might
just
be
is,
saving that person's life. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
Like literally from Suck starting a shotgun that night or some shit. Like literally. I mean, yeah. I mean, the nuance behind it, and like, of course, people are going to look at it as like, oh, that guy's got an alcohol addiction or whatever. And I mean, such a common thing in Western culture to have, and an alcohol addiction. It's like, we can easily blame it on heritage. If you've got Irish in you, that's easy. You just go, oh, look, Irish, and it's just like,
yeah.
and
Thanks. You solved my problem. I'm Irish.
yeah, exactly. I was like, oh, when I look at my genealogy, it's like 58% Irish. Well, it's like it says 58% from the UK, and then when you look at it, it's like 48% Irish. And then I mean, who are we kidding? Those Brits are just as alcoholic as the Irish. So it's not, potato,
Mm-hmm.
potato, uh, as far as that goes. Um, so yeah, I mean, we can blame that, but then but that's not why the person is drinking. Like, that's not the reason they're drinking so excessively. Is just because they're Irish or uh, uh from that area. So
It looks like we're on the cusp of um, maybe closing this one off, wrapping it up, and then doing a part two for today. Let me
yes,
finish what I started reading here, and then let's get to that, and we'll reconvene and start on the other topics we intended to get to.
yeah,
It's incredible this went so far and abroad. Anyway, let me finish here. If allostasis is social connection, there are profound long-term consequences for the individual and their families. The hippocampus, responsible for encoding memory, that's a part of the brain that's right next to the amygdala, it turns out, in the limbic
oh,
system, undergoes atrophy and is associated with conditions such as recurrent depressive illness, Cushing's syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, mild cognitive impairment in aging, and schizophrenia. So there are non-trivial consequences to a oversensitized limbic system. And some of the behavioral responses to chronic stress lead to adaptive behaviors that can further increase risk for harm or disease. Common behavioral responses such as smoking, alcohol consumption, or poor diet and health practices may have at least perceived adaptive effects in the short run, but similar to antisocial responses such as hostility and aggression will have damaging effects in the long run. That was what I wanted to get to as the capstone statement to this really great news that researchers in cancer are discovering the connection between how these products of glycosis are suppressing, tumor suppressing mechanisms of the cell. This is huge. And what do you say we wrap this one up, Pierce?
I think that sounds like a good idea. We're going to be going straight into a second parter of this because we were talking about addiction, but I think this first, we might just call this episode cancer, uh, because that was kind of felt like the main topic of discussion here. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a nice. Um, so yeah, let's go ahead and we're gonna, if you liked what we were doing, we're gonna be starting another episode right away, but go ahead and like and subscribe if you like what we're talking about. And yeah, I'll talk to you in just a second, Richard.
All right, buddy. I'll see you next time.